Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today is going to be the Commission's second All SB1 Competitive Programs workshop on incorporating transportation equity into our competitive program guidelines. I'm seeing we have about maybe like a third of our registered attendees currently joining, and so I am gonna just hold off from starting the workshop until about 3 minutes after the hour. So I will come back on at 1:03. Thank you. Okay, we are at 3 minutes past the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. So thank you again for joining us, everyone, for our second workshop to discuss the SB1 competitive programs on better incorporating transportation equity into our program guidelines. We held our first workshop to discuss this topic back in December, and so this is kind of a follow-up workshop to our efforts to develop some of that language that has been informed by the feedback that we received from all of our stakeholders. So before I get into some of the overview for our presentation today, Kayla, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. I will introduce myself. So my name is Matthew Yozgat, and I am the Deputy Director for SB1 Programming at the Commission. And I will ask Sequoia to introduce herself, please.
Thanks, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Sequoia Erasmus, and I work with the Commission as the Associate Deputy Director for Equity and Engagement with the planning team. And I'm delighted to work with Matthew today to share out what we've been working on.
Excellent. Thanks, Sequoia. Before we move it over to logistics, I just wanted to let everybody know that these efforts have been a really kind of joint partnership here on the Commission staff between my SB1 programming team, which is Christine Gordon is the program manager for the local partnership program, Hannah Walter, who's the program manager for the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, and Naveen Habib, who is the program manager for the Solutions for Congested Corridors program. And it's been a partnership with Sequoia and Laura Pennybaker on our planning team. So we are very pleased to be bringing to you today some of our joint efforts for the program guidelines. And with that, Kayla, I will ask you to please give some of the meeting logistics for anyone who wants to participate.
Thanks, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Our workshops normally take place in different locations around the state. However, containment measures surrounding COVID-19 have required us to adjust to a webinar format. Please bear with us should we encounter any technical challenges. The workshop agenda is located under the handouts tab today. Oh, I'm sorry about that. That is incorrect. Today we don't have the agenda under the handouts tab, but you can find it on our Commission website. So under the handouts tab, you'll find some attachments that Matthew will talk about and the PowerPoint presentation. For participants joining us through GoToWebinar, please find the webinar panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. There you will find the audio question and handouts tabs. Under the audio tab, you have the choice to listen in via the computer or telephone option. If you prefer computer audio, please select the appropriate box. If you prefer the phone call option, select the corresponding box and dial the phone number, access code, and audio PIN as directed by the automated system. Please note that if the audio PIN is not entered, you will remain in listen-only mode and will be unable to speak should you have a comment. As a reminder, each registered attendee is provided a unique link and phone number to access the webinar. These cannot be shared with other participants as they are registered to a specific attendee. We welcome comments and questions from attendees as part of each topic at this workshop. There will also be an opportunity for comments and questions at the end of the presentation. There are two options for participants to provide comments. You may click on the hand icon to indicate you wish to make a comment. You will then be unmuted and called upon to make your comment. Please be sure to state your name and affiliation prior to voicing your remarks. Also, please use the raise hand feature as early into the topic as you can to give the system time to acknowledge you. If you raise your hand to speak, please do not lower your hand until you are done making your comment. This will help us ensure that you can be unmuted properly. You may also use the questions tab to submit a question or comment. Please type in the topic you are commenting on and your comment. Commission staff will read the comment on your behalf. You will not be able to be on camera while making your comments. Thanks again for joining us today. Back to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Kayla. We can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of an overview on what we want to cover with everyone today. I just want to say that today's presentation is as Kayla mentioned, is included as an attachment in the webinar handouts tab, and that a recording of this workshop will be posted to the Commission's website following today's workshop. In that we do plan on covering kind of some background and overview on the development of the language, which we have shared with our stakeholder group, I believe earlier last week. But we'll discuss some of the development that went into the language that you saw, and then we will get into the presentation of the specific language updates. So we have a new SB1 competitive program equity supplement that we'll be introducing. This will be a standalone document which will be incorporated into all three program guidelines as a tool and a resource which will ask applicants to utilize in how they respond to some of the new questions that we're asking in our evaluation criteria. And then we'll actually share the revisions in the program guidelines under the evaluation criteria for all three programs. I would like to caveat that if discussion continues, or if any attendees joining us today haven't really had a chance to review the material that we've shared and haven't been able to maybe form opinions or want to take more time to provide us feedback, we would first off love to engage with all of you today, but we can also continue discussion in our respective program workshops, which we'll have later in April, and we'll share the dates for those workshops at the end of today's workshop. So with that, Kayla, we can move on to the next slide, and I will ask Sequoia to present this slide with me.
Sure, thanks. So for today's workshop and for the majority, for everything that we do at the Commission, we're more and more rooting ourselves with our racial equity statement that highlights the importance of transportation equity. So the California Transportation Commission recognizes that throughout California's history, improvements to the state's transportation system have disproportionately benefited some population groups and burdened others. And while infrastructure improvements were being built, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color were disenfranchised and were underrepresented in government decision-making. Next slide, please. And further, the Commission condemns all forms of racism and is actively working to promote equitable outcomes throughout our programs, policies, and practices. And in line with the Commission's racial equity statement, our staff is actively working to promote equitable outcomes through our programs, policies, and practices. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Sequoia. And based on what Sequoia just said, these important principles, as well as the Commission's racial equity statement, have set the stage for a lot of the changes that we're endeavoring on in our SB1 competitive programs this cycle, as well as our other programs at the Commission in current or near coming cycles. So to kind of put into context where we've been and where we're headed with the revisions for the 3 SB1 competitive programs, as I mentioned at the start of the workshop, we started this conversation off back in December. So on December 16th, Sequoia and I actually did discuss proposed revisions as an idea and posed some questions that our attendees engaged with and responded to during that workshop and following that workshop. And so a lot of the feedback we received in that workshop did inform where we're headed with the revisions to the guidelines this cycle. And again, just on the left side of your screen, you see the 3 programs that I'm referring to. It's the Local Partnership Competitive Program, the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, and the Solutions for Congested Corridors Program. This spring is actually considered right now. So we are actively working on the language, which we have sent, kind of published, if you will, last week on the Commission's website and did send out to our distribution list. The language is included as well in the resources tab, or the handouts tab, I should say, on the GoToWebinar today. So you will see 4 attachments, which I'll elaborate on here shortly. Also, I want to say we have been working closely hand in hand with the Commission's Equity Advisory Roundtable. We've presented some of our thoughts and sought feedback at, I believe, 2 equity advisory roundtables thus far, and we had a kind of a small group of volunteers, about a handful of equity advisory roundtable members that did work with us more closely on the development of the language and providing us feedback, which we incorporated into what we shared last week. Moving forward in the timeline, in June. So at the June CTC meeting, I believe it's the last week of June, we will be bringing draft guidelines for all 3 programs to the commissioners for their consideration and for their feedback, which is kind of a 2-step process to getting the guidelines hopefully adopted by the Commission at the August CTC meeting. So that's the last time frame you see on there. So what we're talking about today is specific to the equity supplement, as well as the evaluation criteria changes that we're proposing. We will be bringing all 3 program guidelines with all the changes that we've proposed and workshopped this cycle in June and in August. And I do believe we sent those out as attachments. I believe it was 2A, 3A, and 4A, which are not included in the handouts tab, but they're on our workshops page if you want to refer to them. And those are all of the kind of standout edits for the upcoming Cycle 3 program guidelines, so that stakeholders can see what we've proposed changing this cycle. So you can move on to the next slide, please, Kayla. And I believe I will turn it back over to Sequoia to explain some of the takeaways from our workshop.
Yeah, thank you. So as Matthew mentioned, we held a workshop in December 2021, and in the next few slides, I'll share some of our key takeaways from that event, as well as from our other stakeholder engagement processes that we were part of. And I also want to reiterate that we're very grateful for all of the feedback that we received from many of you who are on this call right now, or who will be checking out this information later. These conversations have been really, really valuable and meaningful, and there's a lot of really important knowledge out there, and really look forward to continuing to work on this process with you as we continue to put this together. So our December key takeaways included feedback on how to kind of how we can meaningfully consider transportation equity in our SB1 programs. And what we heard was a lot around encouraging early community participation in the planning process, and that not just being our traditional outreach protocols of notification, but also getting in conversations that are already happening and finding out what are the community priority project areas and focus areas, and working on projects that really stem from that level of community participation. Further, adding community support as a criterion within the SB1 program's equity guidelines was an additional takeaway that we brought. And keeping the approach simple, we recognize that there are a lot of different ways that we can understand the nuance of equity, and that communities themselves and folks working in partnership with community have very tried and true methods of working together. And by us keeping the approach simple, that you'll be able to kind of bring the nuance out more of what you did at the more local level. So that's what we heard. Next slide, please. Additionally, workshop participants preferred incorporating equity throughout the guidelines as applicable, with changes in the evaluation criteria to influence project selection. And this was part of a question that we had around, should we have a separate equity focus section or kind of weave it in throughout? And so what we heard was weave it in throughout. And finally, that the specific feedback recorded from the workshop is definitely being incorporated into the draft SB1 program's proposed guidelines language. Next slide, please. From our other stakeholder engagement workshops, we heard a lot around current practices of identifying equity in projects or practices. This was part of some of our Slido questions that we had in previous workshops, as well as direct questions to our MPO and state and local partners. And participants recommended the following questions to help identify impacts to disadvantaged, vulnerable, or marginalized communities. So some of the questions that were recommended include, how does a project affect adjacent neighborhoods to projects? How does this project benefit disadvantaged communities? What transportation barriers or burdens does this project relieve or remove? And a lot of conversation around support for furthering fair housing initiatives. So the nexus of transportation and housing has really been heard loud and clear throughout this process as well. Next slide, please. So other current practices of identifying equity in projects or practices include focusing on access to opportunities like jobs and education from disadvantaged communities. We heard that project benefits such as travel time by walking, biking, and transit are important for build and no build scenarios. Additionally, identifying multimodal considerations is important, and indicating how the project was identified. Kind of as I mentioned earlier in our key takeaways, was it sort of in the project pipeline, or was it part of a community conversation? Is it part of a broader project scope through multiple grants, etc.? Next slide, please. And so we also heard and asked about what are challenges that folks are having with incorporating equity. And one area that we heard a lot about was project development and funding applications. So we heard that funding constraints can hamper the ability to properly address equity. We also heard that it's important to localize equity indicators within a region. We heard from applicants that there is often a lack of historical data for rural or smaller communities. Additionally, there is sometimes an inability to fund community-based organization participation, which I think a lot of us recognize is a really important piece of community engagement. Further, it can be difficult for some areas to obtain the political support or lack of support, or experience a lack of support from more affluent communities, which can be a challenge. And we also heard that they're kind of in alignment with this, that rural and suburban locations find it hard to compete with urban areas because the urban areas are seen as, or sorry, the smaller rural locations are seen as affluent or kind of not shown as having disproportionate impacts, despite having real issues and challenges. And finally, we heard that there's often can be a duplication of efforts by multiple agencies in the same geographic area. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I have a different. So throughout the process, I have a different slide.
I think we're missing one slide,
Okay.
which unfortunately I'm realizing might be several slides. So I don't know what happened. So really quick, okay, we're gonna have to, because there was a section after this I realized is appearing on our version of the PowerPoint that is appearing that it might have deleted out of the PDF that we shared. So really quick, do you want to just describe the community characteristics and the environmental characteristics on the slide that we have? And I'm going to try and troubleshoot this before we before we proceed.
No problem. And it'll take me a couple minutes to get through it. So so on the next slide, not the one that's being displayed right now, will demonstrate some of the example equity metrics that we heard throughout our stakeholder engagement process of important community characteristics and environmental characteristics that our partners in MPOs and local jurisdictions and other statewide agencies are utilizing to measure equity. And I definitely want to recognize and acknowledge that there are a lot that, again, it's a very kind of nuanced process. But what we heard throughout some of our engagement processes are some examples of community characteristics include things like looking at the number of households without access to a vehicle. Another example of an equity metric that we heard was looking at language isolation and languages other than English spoken at home. We also heard a percentage who qualify for free lunch, although later on in the process we heard that there's been a universal free lunch kind of push, so that might not be as useful of a metric anymore. So we ended up not utilizing it. Another example of an equity metric includes broadband access, rent burden, population density, race and ethnicity distribution, and grievances. So maybe looking at like illegal dumping hotspots, or people calling in to report potholes or environmental concerns. And then next I'll move on to the environmental characteristics that we heard when we asked the question around what equity metrics are folks using in their analysis. And we heard about the Healthy Places Index. We've heard about folks using CalEnviroscreen. An environmental characteristic that we also heard about is prolonged exposure to pollutants. And lastly, health burden. So that's just a small sample of some of the metrics that we heard, and definitely acknowledge that there are a lot that folks are using, and I really want to keep the conversation open with our partners throughout the state. As you develop your tools, we want to hear what you're using, what's working, what's changing, what is demonstrating a more broad aspect to equity. All right, that's it for me. Moving on
Thank
to
you,
Matt.
Sequoia. So I think so. I just got the revised PowerPoint shared with Kayla. I believe this one is going to go away that you're seeing, and we will have the appropriate one brought back up. So thank you all for bearing with us while we troubleshot this one during the PowerPoint. And I think that also means that the PowerPoint we have linked as a handout is probably incorrect. So we will make sure that we share the corrected PowerPoint following today's workshop so that everybody has that correctly identified as well. So I'm going to wait for Kayla's cue, but I can go ahead. The slide that you all see right now is actually the next slide. So before we proceed on to this slide, I might pause really quick to see if we had any comments or questions that came in on any of the pieces that Sequoia just presented on.
Hey, Matthew, it's Cherry. I can read off the question.
Okay, thank you.
We have one from Bruce Abernathy, and he's asking, localizing equity indicators must not conflict with the guidance from the SB1 legislation or valuations of DAC and or LIC to the benefit of a higher income region.
Okay, so that sounds more like a comment. So thanks, Bruce. We'll make sure to certainly consider that, and we would agree.
And Matthew, this is Celeste. I do not see any raised hands at the moment.
Okay, hold on 1 second. Give me one moment. I'm sharing the correct PowerPoint again. For those of you that use PowerPoints, there apparently is a button that allows you to hide slides. And if you hide slides and then change it to a PDF, it actually ends up deleting those slides. And I had no idea that we had hidden slides within our PowerPoint. So thank you for bearing with us. There we go. That was the slide that you all were missing. And so I think Sequoia actually did a very, very good job summarizing it. So I don't think we need to spend any more time on this slide, but thank you, Kayla, for swapping the correct one in. Here we go. Okay, so now that we're back on track, thank you all for bearing with us. The feedback that we got was utilized in a couple of different ways. And so that is the bulk of what we would like to share with all of you today, and get any feedback or reaction from you either during today's workshop, or if you'd prefer to spend a little bit more time considering it and sending us comments in writing, we're happy to accept that as well. So the first document that we're going to cover is the equity supplement, which is going to contain key statistics, benefits, and communication strategies that we would encourage, but not requiring agencies to use during project development to yield more equitable outcomes in their projects that they submit. And it also includes some resources that we incorporated to identify anti-displacement strategies. And so Sequoia is going to cover the contents of the major components of the equity supplement here shortly. And for that, I will ask you to refer to, we'll share some of the overarching themes on the PowerPoint, but it is also included as attachment 1, which is not necessarily the first attachment, but it's it's titled Attachment 1 in the Handouts tab. So the equity supplement will be a document that is consistently worded for all 3 of the competitive programs. It will be included in the guidelines as either an appendix or an attachment, depending on how those programs word their additional reference material. But the equity supplement itself is not the added language that will be utilized for evaluation purposes. The supplement is more of an important resource that we would like the responses and the evaluation criteria to be informed by the information that we share in the supplement. Now, in the evaluation criteria sections that we've modified, those are going to be attachments 2, 3, and 4 in the handouts tab, and those are the evaluation criteria sections for each of the programs that we're suggesting changes to, which again will be the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, the Trade Corridor Enhancement program, and the Local Partnership program. Those are a snapshot of the evaluation criteria section only, because the evaluation criteria is how the commission staff is able to assess and evaluate projects that are most competitive. And so in order for equity to integrate in a way of our programs that can actually influence project selection, we decided that the best way to do that was to actually include new evaluation criteria around community development. And so I'll cover those proposals after Sequoia covers the makeup of the equity supplement. But just wanted to kind of frame it for everyone, as I know we shared a lot of attachments. I hope that we, kind of caveated what each of them were, but just so that everyone understands, we are proposing specific evaluation criteria changes to the 3 programs, and we're asking applicants to refer to the supplement for best practices and for strategies and equitable outcomes that they use to inform how they respond to those questions. So I think I've talked on that one enough, so I will hand it over to Sequoia and we can move on to the next slide.
Thanks, Matthew. So as Matthew mentioned, in the next couple slides, I'll go over the draft language that we've posted from the equity supplement. So the purpose of the SB1 equity supplement is to help document how a project incorporates transportation equity by responding to key guidelines questions like, was outreach conducted with disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized groups within the project study area, and how was that input incorporated into the project? Further, what actions were taken to protect the state's most disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized populations within the project study area from negative project impacts? And how did the project sponsor assess whether the project would result in any disparate impacts on the basis of race, color, socioeconomic status, gender, sexuality, or national origin? Next slide, please. And some examples of indicators used to identify disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized groups are pursuant to the California Health and Safety Code section 39711, where disadvantaged communities are identified based on geographic, socioeconomic, public health, and environmental hazard criteria. Disadvantaged communities may include, but are not limited to, either of the following: areas disproportionately affected by environmental pollution and other hazards that can lead to negative public health effects, exposure, or environmental degradation. And 2, areas with concentrations of people that are of low income, high unemployment, low levels of home ownership, high rent burden, sensitive populations, or low levels of educational attainment. And I'll add that sometimes throughout these slides so far, we've used disadvantaged communities as a describer, And we'll, moving forward, be using disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized groups per feedback on using kind of one recurring way of describing communities. So this is how we'll be describing equity communities moving forward. Thanks. Next slide, please. All right, and here are some examples of indicators for consideration that we'd like to include in our guidelines language. So that includes median household income, CalEnviroScreen, Healthy Places Index, Native American and tribal lands, and other possible indicators that may be included include census data, senior or elder populations, carless households and single parent households, additionally immigrant or foreign-born households, veterans, public transit users, unemployment, risk of displacement, households receiving public assistance, nearby amenities, traffic safety indicators, and community-derived safety information. Next slide, please.
Sequoia, I'm gonna stop you really quick because I believe we have a hand raised.
Okay, great.
All right, Sarkis, you are unmuted.
Thank you. Hi, Sequoia. Hi, Matthew. Hope you had a good weekend. Thank you for developing a really great document. It was very easy to read, and Matthew, you guys did a great job labeling the attachment, so I wouldn't worry about that. One piece of input I had was for the active transportation program, the CTC allows for a regional definition. That was something that we would like to advocate for as a type of indicator for the supplement for the SB1 programs.
Thanks, Sarkis. I think that came up in conversations, and so we will absolutely consider it. The specific section in the supplement where we could make changes is kind of escaping me since I don't have it in front of me right now. But if you do have any suggestions on, or I can say if any attendees have suggestions on how to modify either the supplement or the guidelines language, go ahead and please, make your suggested revisions where you'd like to see them and send them to us to inform kind of our final draft. But I do recall that being brought up, Sarkis, and we may not have captured it in this version, but we will further consider it.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. We do have 2 additional raised hands if you'd like to take those. Okay. Denise Arriaga, you are unmuted.
Hi, Matt and Sequoia. Thanks again for the work that you've done on making sure that everyone's included in these conversations and dialogues. This is Denise Arriaga from OCTA. Just wanted to share that, yeah, we're definitely encouraged that CTC staff has recognized the importance of context sensitivity and just providing this range of example indicators for identifying benefits to DACs, and then also just still maintaining that flexibility for other indicators to be used as appropriate. I did notice in this equity supplement that option for the other indicator still reads as if these options for an other indicator are only allowable if there is insufficient data in the first 4 examples that are listed. So I would just recommend that language kind of just more explicitly state that these other alternatives can be selected regardless of data availability for the more common ones if applicants truly believe that these tell the story and give context for the benefits maybe more accurately or more appropriately than the ones that are more common.
Thanks, Denise. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, and our next hand is Kenny Cow. You are unmuted.
Hi, this is Kenny from MTC. Again, I did want to thank everyone, Matthew and Sequoia. I think you've done a really great job in making this really easy to read. And thank you again for sending this out a little early so we can have a look at it. I also wanted to support the two comments made by Sarkis as well as Denise. I think specifically, on the other category, those are some great metrics that actually we use a lot of those already in our regional definition of equity priority communities. And so, rather than having sponsors, have to look every one of those up, for a regional definition, if that can be included, that already incorporates a lot of those other factors. I think that would be a lot easier potentially for the sponsors to just look at that rather than having to pull up all the various other metrics. So just like to also make a plug for putting regional definition as one of the metrics there. So thanks.
Thank you, Kenny. Yeah, and I apologize. I'm looking on the screen. I'm referring to the supplement itself. I do see where I think we received some feedback and maybe hadn't adequately worked on incorporating it or not. So I'll just say that between Kenny, Sarkis, and Denise's comments just now, we hear you, and we'll take those suggestions and see if something additional can be worked out in the supplement.
All right, Matthew and Sequoia, not seeing any additional hands.
Okay. Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Sequoia.
Yeah, thanks again for those comments and for continuing to support us in the development of this supplement. So I'll move on to the next portion of what we'd like to, back one slide, please. Include as examples of equity benefits. I didn't read this slide, right? No, I don't think so. Sorry, sometimes I feel like I'm a little bit in a loop. Okay, so some examples of equity benefits that we heard and we included in this draft include increased access to social, educational, and economic opportunities, improved access and safety of active transportation, prioritizing high needs areas, reducing travel times, congestion, and pollution, prioritizing contracts with historically marginalized populations, improved accessibility to amenities such as shopping centers, health centers, schools, social services, transit centers, and employment sites, and ensuring neighborhood stability through short and long-term anti-displacement strategies. I'll take a moment and see if there's any questions or comments on equity benefits.
Hi, Sequoia. I'm not seeing any written questions or comments or hands raised at the moment.
Okay, thank you. All right, next slide, please. Great, thanks. So the examples of community engagement strategies that we included in the draft are identify, contact, document, and follow up on communications to disadvantaged or historically marginalized groups, demonstrate how community perspectives were included in the project, meaningful engagement with tribal governments and incorporation of feedback, and partner with and fund or contract local organizations to support engagement and project completion. And again, this is an example of some community engagement strategies, not all. Next slide, please. We also wanted to include some anti-displacement resources in the supplement because we mentioned it a few times. So we have 5 pretty well, there's a lot of information throughout all of these resources that we listed. So for example, the California Department of Housing and Community Development has a very, very robust document listed in the first link. The Urban Anti-Displacement Project is a website that has a lot of resources available. The third link is for a framework for evaluating anti-displacement policies. The fourth link is for a report on greening without gentrification that we were recommended. And although I think it's more about parks, it still utilizes a lot of interesting anti-displacement measures that could potentially be applied to housing displacement mitigation. And finally, a link to a case study around transit-oriented development without displacement strategies to help Pacoima businesses thrive. And we thank our partners out there who help link us to these resources so that we can provide more information on a part of our supplement that we are integrating around displacement. And that, I believe, is all for me. Thank you. Unless there's any questions or comments on this slide.
Thanks, Sequoia. I'm not seeing hands raised or written questions or comments at the moment.
Thanks. With that, then I will turn it over to Matthew.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sequoia. And so now we're going to transition into the actual draft revisions that we're proposing for the 3 SB1 competitive programs. So again, you can refer to attached. So the first program will be the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, which we have kind of plucked some language out of section 16 of those guidelines, which is the evaluation criteria section, and all of these changes for the SCCP program are included in attachment 2 on the handouts tab. So the first change that we're recommending to the solutions program is under an existing evaluation criteria, accessibility, and we are asking that a nomination also address, if identifiable, to include destinations that may be priority destinations for disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized communities, and describe how the project increases accessibility to key destinations for that same population, which we're saying can be identified with maps that overlay the population distribution by various demographics. So we are proposing to add a bit more onto the existing accessibility criteria, and then economic development and job creation and retention is also an existing evaluation criteria, and we're proposing to include the language you see highlighted there under number 3, which is that a nomination must address how the project supports economic development and improves access to employment for disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized communities. So kind of keeping with the theme of some of these changes, these are 2 existing evaluation criteria that we did identify, and through working with some of our stakeholders that did provide feedback, we could maybe ramp up what we consider in evaluation. So unless there are any comments or questions on these proposed revisions, we can move on to the next slide, which I apologize is a bit wordy, and I'm not going to read all of that off. I doubt most of you can probably see that without maximizing the zoom on the PowerPoint. So I'll cover this just kind of in an overview. I do see a hand raised, so maybe that might be on the last slide. So let's go to the hand raise and then I'll cover this section.
Sarkis Kachek, you're unmuted.
Hello, hi Matthew. On the prior slide, sorry for going back to the prior one, but
that's fine.
Under question or section 2, accessibility, I understand the focus on projects for that are improving transportation options for historically impacted and marginalized communities. If you're not an area that has had those types of communities how would you be evaluated compared to a project or a corridor that does provide improvements for historically impacted communities?
So that's a really good point, Circus. And I think, so we do look at it two ways, right? So we do have for disadvantaged, which I think going back to the conversation we were having when we were discussing the supplement, which was around, there are a lot of regions that have done a lot of work to identify, kind of regional definitions for what disadvantaged is and what that means in that particular part of the state or particular region. So I would say, because we are reserving the opportunity to go back and consider that in the supplement, and each of these changes here are kind of through the lens of that supplement. We could focus more on, how would Santa Barbara, demonstrate that they're providing accessibility enhancements to key destinations for the disadvantaged population in Santa Barbara County as identified through the regional definition, utilizing the same, maps that could overlay population distribution by various demographics. I think, I know that historically impacted and marginalized communities is very specifically defined. But I think this cycle, we certainly kind of going back to some of the things we heard and some of the challenge that we have is that, we do accept a lot of projects in this program from very different parts of the state. If a project is demonstrating that it's increasing accessibility, specifically to historically impacted and marginalized communities, that project is going to have, a lot of consideration and accessibility, but that's not to say it will just completely over-compete against a project that, has identified its own disadvantaged population through a very strict process and is providing accessibility benefits to them as well. So I think it kind of goes
I appreciate that because somebody who grew up in one of those communities, I take this topic very seriously, but at the same time, one size does not fit all in each situation. And so that's why I'm just trying to be mindful of how different projects provide different benefits and for different communities. So that's why I was curious about that. And I think that the way you framed it makes a lot of sense, and we appreciate that approach. So thank you.
Yeah, I think where we're bringing this in to accessibility, we really want to understand that the needs of those that have historically maybe not been focused on when it comes to accessing point A, getting from point A to point B. We just want to know that it is a consideration and that the project itself is, that an applicant is demonstrating how that's happening if and when it's happening. So I think, and we'll touch a bit more on it in the next, when we talk about community engagement on the next slide, because I think that focuses more on, how did an applicant, project applicants go out and engage the public and actually inform their project based on what that community needs. So, but I hope that answers your question. And I still see the hand raise function, and I don't know if that's still Circus or if that's a new hand. So I'll turn it over to my team.
Thank you.
That is still Sarkis, but he is unmuted, or okay. I put his hand down. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. No, that's good. Thanks for the feedback, Sarkis. And yeah, that's the kind of, if anybody has any question about any of this, please feel free to jump in and let's talk about it. So I don't see the hands raised function. I don't believe we had any written comments, so we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so I'll cover this one mostly verbally, unless any of you can see it, hopefully. But again, you can also refer to attachment 2, where you'll see a new section in the Congested Corridors Program Guidelines on item number 6. So in the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, in past cycles, we had considered the type of community engagement that applicants had done. We asked for an explanation and maybe we asked for proof that the community had provided feedback, but we did not evaluate it. So this cycle, we are actually going to evaluate community engagement. And we're going to do it based on the two kind of sub-bullets that you see there. So utilizing the SB1 competitive programs transportation equity supplement that Sequoia just covered, we're going to ask applicants to demonstrate that the impacts of projects on equity were considered by doing two of the following. So identifying disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized communities within the project study area, providing details on how the project engagement was conducted. And then there are several, several additional points, I think, that go under how we're going to ask applicants to identify how they engaged their community. Again, kind of culminating with the examples that we provide in the supplement. But then secondarily on this criteria, we're going to ask applicants to identify that any actions that were taken as a result of that engagement to protect the state's most disadvantaged and historically impacted and marginalized populations, and identify strategies included in the project scope that seek to avoid and or minimize impacts to that same population. So this is kind of a two-tiered criteria where we're asking for the type of engagement that was performed, specifically focusing on some of the feedback that a disadvantaged and historically impacted and marginalized population and how the project changed as a result of that. So that's the kind of the high level explanation of this. Obviously, we will be following the words and the evaluation criteria very closely when this is evaluated in the Solutions for Congested Corridors program. So I might pause there to see if there are any comments or questions on this new evaluation criteria, which will actually increase the amount of evaluation criteria in the Solutions program.
Hi, Matthew. Not seeing any written comments or questions at the moment, and no raised hands yet.
Okay, then I'm gonna continue on. At any point, we can come back to any of these slides. And I'll also just kind of preface that now we're transitioning over to the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program, which the changes will be very similar, if not identical, to those that we're kind of describing in the other programs. So hopefully you're all catching on with some of the theme here, is that we wanted to make consistent changes across the board in our programs. But what you're seeing here, and I just, before I go into this slide, we have made other changes that we believe will provide equitable outcomes in our programs. We're including sections for kind of new information areas that really get to climate change adaptation, public health, and a few other areas. And so we are making other changes to our guidelines, but we don't believe that any of them will have as strong an impact on project selection as the changes that we're covering here today, which are specifically in the evaluation criteria. So I will continue on. So in attachment 3, you will see a snapshot of the evaluation criteria, which is section 18 of the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. And if you're familiar with that program, you'll know that the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program has different factors that make up the evaluation criteria. One of those factors is community impact factors. And so we are proposing to replace the community impact mitigation evaluation criteria, which was existing in the Cycle 2 guidelines, now with the community engagement evaluation criteria, which we really believe takes that prior criteria a step forward. And so I'm not showing the community impact mitigation criteria struck out, but just consider that this new criteria will replace that one and take it a bit further. And so kind of in line with how the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program guidelines are written, you know, we have the kind of lead into the evaluation criteria here on this slide. And then if you don't mind moving on, Kayla, unless there are any comments or questions, we do provide community engagement instructions in the evaluation criteria, as you can see here. And so this is also included in the TCEP evaluation criteria, and it goes very closely hand in hand with what I just covered for the Solutions for Congested Corridors program. So again, the themes are identifying this specific population and the needs of that population and actions that were taken, you know, to amend or augment or incorporate into the proposed project scope that seeks to avoid and minimize impacts to the disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized communities. So again, we don't need to spend too much time on here because I know it's identical to or almost identical to what we shared with Solutions. So if there are no specific comments or questions on the TCEP evaluation criteria proposal, then I think we can move on to the last program or the last set of changes, which are for the local partnership competitive program. So these are again, going to be changes that we're proposing in the evaluation criteria, which is section 13B of those guidelines, and we've included, you know, an extraction of that section included as attachment 4 in the handouts tab. So in the local partnership program, we actually are adding a new evaluation criteria around accessibility, which is going to be very similar to the accessibility criteria that we evaluate in SCCP. But because this is new for the local partnership program, I'll spend a little bit more time. And so I'll say that projects will now be evaluated on whether the project or on how the project nomination should address current accessibility issues and concerns in the project area, and how the project will improve accessibility and connectivity to residents and non-residents that travel or need to travel through the project area. Which is again going to be referring to the general population. How will the project connect to jobs, major destinations, and residential areas? And if identifiable, include destinations that may be priority destinations for disadvantaged or historically impacted and marginalized communities. Describe how the project increases accessibility to key destinations for that same population, which can be identified with maps that overlay the population distribution by various demographics. So I believe this is very similar, if not verbatim, to the accessibility criteria in SCCP, but we identified that this is important to what we believe the intent of the local partnership program is, and therefore that's why we're bringing this in as an evaluated criteria in this program. And before we move on to the next slide, I probably should have put the strikeout that you see on the bottom of this slide to coincide with the next slide. But we are also bringing community engagement in as an evaluated criteria into the local partnership competitive program, but it will actually be replacing the previous regional and community project support evaluation criteria. And so we just wanted to demonstrate that community engagement is replacing an existing criteria, but that we're also adding accessibility. So I believe that will bring the total of evaluation criteria to the local partnership program. That'll bring the total to 10 evaluated criteria. So unless there are any comments or questions on the inclusion of accessibility as a new criteria and the deletion of the support as a removed criteria. Kind of in the theme with the changes we've made in TSEP and SCCP, we are bringing in community engagement to be evaluated here. So again, I feel like I've covered this slide pretty well already, so I don't want to focus on this too heavily unless there are any specific questions in the context of LPP. But again, we're asking that applicants utilize the equity supplement that we already identified and presented on, and then apply the indicators and the material in the supplement in responding to these two components of this evaluation criteria. So again, I know we're kind of covering a lot, and I'm not focusing specifically on it, but I think it's because we wanted to make sure that the changes we were making in these programs were consistent and made sense. That we understand that there are some nuances between the three programs, but we also feel that community engagement and appropriate practices, what we are seeking out of the impact that this criteria will have on our program, should be consistent across the three programs. So with that, I might pause and see if there are any comments or questions or suggestions on what we're proposing to amend in the three SB1 competitive programs based on what we talked about here today.
Hi, Matthew. Not seeing any written questions or comments at the moment. And we do have a raised hand. I'll turn it to Celeste.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Thela. Rachel Morricone, you are unmuted.
Hi guys, Rachel Morricone from Santa Cruz. I think a lot of this is great. I am a little worried and just want clarification. So by eliminating the section on regional and community project support and having us allowing applicants to reference the engagement process that we maybe had for our regional transportation plan or development of a voter approved sales tax measure, are you saying that you don't want those to count and you want it to really just focus on outreach related to this very specific project that applicants are putting forward? Or can we still reference some of that, those engagement activities that we did as well?
Rachel, I think that is a very, very good comment on this project or on this program in particular. And so I think and I know Christine is on, and I would invite her to come off if she wants, but I think I can address this in terms of how this criteria, and Kayla, if you wouldn't mind going to the previous slide, please. And I know it's going to reflect all being struck out, but hopefully everybody can see it. So we still are very interested in the outreach that was done and the understanding that, if you have a voter approved sales tax measure that makes you eligible for LPP, we understand that there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into engaging the community and then getting the votes needed to get that majority vote to support a sales tax initiative within that given county. That's all very important community engagement that we would encourage you to still, reflect on in how you respond to the new criteria. I just don't believe we had, we realized that because a lot of the agencies, or most of the agencies that apply in the LPP competitive program were more or less providing very similar responses to one another in the existing regional and communities project support. We wanted to, change it up a bit because because we knew that most agencies had these, exhaustive outreach efforts around sales tax measure, RTP development, which is certainly not to reduce the importance of that, but it was hard to, I think, determine, the competitiveness of responses on this one, if that makes sense. Not to say that it almost turned out to be, like a wash in terms of how the project was rated, because I certainly can't can't assert that, having not managed the program the last cycle, and Christine might tell me that I'm wrong about that, but we felt that you can still, lean on the outreach that you performed, towards RTP development, towards sales tax measure development, but that we're asking for a bit more to, I think, distinguish the types of populations that might have been, identified and engaged, and then how that, in turn, impacted the project that we're evaluating. So we're not going to look the other way if that information is provided. It's certainly important, but I think we're asking for a bit more this cycle. Does that hopefully answer your question? I see Christine coming up. So
I wanted to, yes, I like what you just said, but I think that it also just kind of expands on the public engagement. And so there's agencies that don't have voter approved measures, and I think that just includes everyone. So the ones that have fees, the ones that don't have the voter measures, the ones that have fees, and the ones that, don't have voter approved measures. I think it just kind of puts that category all in one place in terms of the community engagement, if that makes sense, Rachel.
Yeah, this is helpful. The other side of it is we're trying to not overtax our CBOs. So if we did a lot of, specific outreach around our regional transportation plan most recently, and we're just trying not to require or beg them to come to, 4 meetings in a year on, which also covers this project where we've asked them to identify their greatest needs, and then, the projects that we're putting forward might have floated to the top out of those outreach events also. So, it's kind of that balancing act of not asking everyone to come to every single meeting. And then also, but that was helpful. No, I get where you guys are coming from and how you're trying to find those margins of differentiation between what we're doing.
I was on another conversation, and I'm not sure if you were the one who brought it up, but it is a very valid point about overtaxing your CBOs, right? Asking them, relying maybe on them, and then not that they shouldn't be relied on, but also, that understanding that their input is actually meaningful and valued as opposed to, well, we have one more project and we need to go to our CBOs, and and so if that's becoming an issue, and Santa Cruz RTC believes that you have a really solid engagement policy in place in Santa Cruz County, and you might be able to kind of piggyback on some of the efforts that you've had maybe more generally without going back out to to exhaust your community even further. That's good feedback for us to have, I think, in how you respond to this question as well, right? That you might be able to identify how other efforts have demonstrated that these are positive community projects where people are are reflecting that they are going to be doing good things for the community, and that you're kind of tapping into some of existing outreach efforts that RTC already has. We don't want to ask everybody to go back out and recreate a whole new regimen of outreach, but if for instance, if it's a region or a project that might have had no outreach performed on it, we would absolutely encourage going out and trying to get that feedback.
That makes a lot of sense. So one other little part of that I saw was deleted is letters of support from CBOs. Are you not asking agencies to provide letters of support in the new with our grants this time?
Yeah. So I'll let Christine come off if she wants to. We'll always accept. So we like seeing the letters of support from CBOs. We like seeing the letters of support from nonprofit leaders from the region, from elected officials from the region. You don't need to not send that if you have it already. But certainly, I think producing a letter of support from a CBO that was engaged would still be very valuable in how you respond to the new criteria. and it could be like a mechanism that your response could point to, CBO, X is, focuses on this particular transportation issue and is in full support and see a support letter in the attachment of the project nomination or something like that.
Okay, sounds
Yeah,
good. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, I agree, Matthew. I think the more that's going to provide that community support and community engagement, Rachel, I think is going to just kind of increase the the support of the project and showing us that the community was engaged. You have the support letters from the community-based organizations. I think that just kind of builds on that community, the public engagement and what we're trying to get at. So no, I would say if you have it, please send it with your nomination.
Will do. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Christine, for jumping in. Okay, before we, I'm going to turn it back over to Kayla, or I might just verbally ask if there's any additional comments or questions from our attendees at this time, because we're going to start wrapping this up.
Hi, Matthew. No written questions or comments at the moment, and I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay, so then why don't we go ahead and go a couple slides further to closing and next steps. So thank you. Okay, so again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm hopeful that we provided enough time in advance of today's workshop to have your hands-on with the material that we're proposing. But again, I want to say, if today is the first time you're seeing any of this material, or if you haven't been able to get enough consideration on what we've provided and you want to continue to make feedback or reserve the opportunity to provide us with more feedback, please do so. These guidelines are not final until the commission votes to approve final guidelines. I would say we would preferably receive all comments on any of the proposals that we have for our guidelines by next month in May to inform the draft guidelines that we send to commissioners, so that our commissioners are reviewing a document that's been informed by all of our stakeholders that are interested in making specific recommendations that we can work on and incorporate if we can get consensus behind them. And we'll also be talking about kind of a summary of what I just talked about today regarding the integration of equitable outcomes in the evaluation criteria and the equity supplement at the upcoming April workshops for the 3 programs. But before I ask Kayla to move on to the next slide, I'll say one next step that I think we heard, both Sequoia and I heard in the supplement, was to consider, I believe it was on the other category, the regional definition of disadvantaged community, and giving an opportunity to regions to demonstrate all of the work that they've put into the careful crafting of a regional definition. And I understand that that is also consistent with what the Active Transportation Program allows for. So Sequoia and I are going to go back and take a look at that and work with my executive team to see if that's a change that we're going to make. And then we'll obviously, I believe, post the final revisions based on this conversation, along with the 3 respective program guidelines for those upcoming workshops this month. So we'll get if we make revisions based on today's conversation, and I believe that was probably the prevailing comment that we heard, we'll make those changes, and I'll call that out in our upcoming workshops. So Sequoia, am I missing any next steps besides, I believe that was the one that we heard the most feedback on? And not hearing Sequoia, I'm going to assume that that was it. So Kayla, we can proceed to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we do have 3 more SB1 program workshops this month. We have a Solutions for Congested Corridors program on Friday. So this week from 1 to 4, you do not see the, and Kayla told me this was happening, so it'll go back. There we go. It's like a glitch or something. So apologies for that. We have registration links set up, I believe, for all 3 of these program workshops currently on our workshops page. And I do plan on showing up in Christine's SCC or Naveen's SCCP workshop, Hannah's TCEP workshop, and Christine's LPP workshop to summarize the changes that we discussed today. So if, for instance, you weren't able to provide feedback today or needed some more time to think about it, we'll invite it again during these workshops. And as I mentioned, the last next step is us getting our kind of draft guidelines post-workshop all prepared for commissioners for the June CTC meeting. So we'll end up posting that before the June commission meeting in May. And Kayla, you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I did get one text. And forgive me for not calling this out earlier. There is an Equity Advisory Roundtable meeting on April 29th as well. And this will be an agenda item where Sequoia will provide an update to the roundtable during that. So there are still actually 4 additional opportunities to provide us with feedback on the changes that we talked about today, or any other suggestions for the guidelines. And this slide contains my contact information. It also contains Sequoia's contact information. I really want to wholeheartedly thank Sequoia for the commitment and the time that she's been putting into this. I believe this is her first cycle with commission programs and commission guidelines. So we've really valued the collaboration that we've had with our planning team and getting to the language that we were able to propose today. And so with that, you can send either of us comments. I believe the next slide is just kind of a default where to find the commission generally. I do get a lot of questions about how to get on the commission's distribution list. If you email that ctc@catc.ca.gov, which is our general email, and just request to be added, that is probably the best way to do so. And we're also on social media at Twitter and Facebook. So with that, I don't have anything else to update all of you on. I do appreciate all of your time this afternoon and the time that you spent working with us towards these changes the past several months, and looking forward to bringing our draft guidelines for all 3 programs to our stakeholders and the commissioners later in June. So I'll do one last call for any comments or questions. Otherwise, hope everybody has a nice rest of your Monday afternoon.
Hi, Matthew. Not seeing any hands raised and no written questions or comments.
Okay. Since it's been fairly silent at the end, and I know we normally just wait around for a couple minutes, I'm gonna just say I think everybody was able to ask or comment on what they wanted. So feel free to reach us by email or show up to a subsequent workshop, and we can close it out now. Thank you very much, Kayla, and thank you, Celeste and Sherry, for your support on this as well.